1.
Hello everyone, how we doing today? Kyle Williams here at the Monument of 156 New York State Volunteers. Great lecture previously by Sir Paul Thompson. Those are hard acts to follow, but regardless, I have an interesting presentation for you today. Today's presentation is a little different. Normally, I like to talk about the battles, right? I like to talk about the upper command. I like to talk about Nephi. I like to talk about Sharp. I like to talk about Erastus Cook. But what really inspired this particular report was I wanted to know about the men that aren't mentioned, right? I wanted to know about the average soldier. I wanted to know about the trials and tribulations they faced. So how did I come to this report? So I started my report by studying the muster rolls. Now the muster rolls are a great piece of information because they provide the age of the soldier, they provide where they enlisted, it provides when maybe they were promoted, and it also provides if they lived or passed away. So as I'm combing through the muster rolls, I found a lot of interesting information that I had never known before. And that's what spiraled into this presentation for you today. So again, the Mountain Legion served from 1862 to 1865, and they saw action at Fort Bisland, Port Hudson. They were at Brashear City. They were at Manjura. They were at Opequon Creek, also known as 3rd Winchester, and Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek. The monument notates all of these great battles that the 156 fought in. Now, again, I wanted to know about the minutia, right? The details of the regiment. There are not many reports out there on how many men served in the 156. You know, how many men died of disease? How many men died in combat? There are some rough numbers that are found online, but really I wanted to know how many men died of disease. Now, the report that I found online specifically lumps disease and disability together. I didn't want that. I want to know how many men died of disease. And not only that, but I wanted to know what month they died, what day they died. So that's really what inspired the story, okay? So the 156 New York, the composition of the 156 New York. Interesting factoid, on November 13th, 1862, just 5 days before the 156 officially mustered, 3 companies of the 175th were ordered to attach to the Mountain Legion to fill their quota. Again, a regiment, to be a regiment has to have around 1,000 men. The 156 at the time had about 700 or so men. So to fill the quota, to create a regiment, the state of New York grabbed some men from a different regiment and pieced them to the Mountain Legion to form the regiment. 3 companies came from Staten Island. 324 men, it's a lot of men. 324 men came from Staten Island, and they were combat-ready troops attached to the Mountain Legion. So when the 156 New York mustered into service on November 17, 1862, they had 977 men in totality. And I broke it down. This was not a report found. I mean, I'm telling you, I literally had to tally all of this in the report. 945 men were combat-ready troops, 14 drummer boys, 4 musicians, 1 bugler, 3 wagoneers, and 1 teamster all comprised the regiment on the day it officially mustered on November 17th, 1862. Now, I also broke it down by company, right? So again, this took me so long, Paul, you have no idea. So for the staff of the regiment, there were 14 men. Of the 14 men, 5 were combat strength, right? Company A was commanded by Captain Ferdinand Griggs. 97 men were in Company A. Those were men from New Paltz, Plattekill, Gardner, and Shawangunk. Captain Fowler of Company B was comprised of men from Kingston, Woodstock, Marbletown, and Lloyd, which is where we are now. This is the town of Lloyd. In Company B, there were 74 men combat ready. Company C was commanded by Captain William Van Wagenen. Those were men from Warsing, Hurley, Durham, and Esopus. 82 men from Company C. Company D, our beloved Alfred Nephi, captain at the time. 86 men were combat ready. They were from Warsing, Kingston, Marbletown, and Shawangunk. Captain E, my favorite, personal favorite, Captain Matthias Ewan, 86 men of combat strength, Plattekill, Shawangunk, Gardner, and New Paltz. Company F was Captain Baxter, 108 men, very large company. Kingston, Saugerties, Hurley, and Oliveville townships created Company F. Company G was commanded by John Donaldson of Marlborough, Esopus, Kingston, and Saugerties. 83 men comprised Company G. The last three companies, again, were from Long Island, from the 175th. Company H was commanded by Captain John Vaughan, and that was from Southfield, Castleton, Newtown, and Hillsdale, Long Island. 107 men in that company. Company I was commanded by Orville Jewett from Greenville, Northfield, Castleton, and Hillsdale, and that is 116. That is the largest company in the Mountain Legion, or the 156 New York, is Company I, 116 men, combat ready. Company K was 100 men, which was commanded by Captain Shelton, and that was also from Castleton, Northfield, Hillsdale, and Newtown. Now, interesting regimental notes that I found per the muster rolls. Now, before the regiment even formed, New York State gave authorization to raise a new regiment. Before the regiment was even the 156, before it was the Mountain Legion, they were actually starting to take recruits. Who was the instrumental figure in raising some of these new recruits into this unknown regiment at the time? Colonel George H. Sharp, and he was a colonel of the 20th New York. He mustered in the first handful of 156 New York officers and soldiers before Erastus Cook was commissioned colonel to command the regiment. Thought that was really interesting. Per the report that I found, the first soldiers to volunteer as members of the 156 were 32-year-old Private Homer Averill of Kingston from Company B, and 18-year-old First Corporal William Mills of Esopus, Company G. They both joined August 2nd, 1862. First two soldiers to enlist in the Mountain Legion, August 2nd, 1862. The first officer to be commissioned to lead in the newly forming regiment was 32-year-old Captain Thomas Fowler of Kingston. Very unfortunate, Captain Fowler actually is killed at the Battle of Port Hudson, as he was a major at the time, but he was the first officer to enlist in the Mountain Legion on July 18th, 1862. Now put this into perspective. Erastus Cook, who was the colonel, the first colonel of the regiment, enlisted on August 23rd, 1862. Think about that, right? So several weeks, months prior is when the regiment started to form the Mountain Legion. Now, I just have a couple. I don't have to go through all of these, but I notated all the interesting stories that I found in the muster rolls. I'll go through a few of them. Maybe I'll read them all. I'll just see how it goes. Your hands are probably getting cold. I apologize. So John S. Atkinson, he's 28 years old. He died of sunstroke. I thought that was interesting. August 13th, 1863 at Baton Rouge. I'll just read down here a little bit. Here's an interesting story. Richard Dowlin, he was 23 years old from Long Island, so he was one of those 175th men. He was captured in action at the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, and he was transferred as a POW to Wilmington, North Carolina. He escapes from prison on April 27, 1865, returns back to the regiment, and survives the war. Think about that. Captured POW at the Battle of Cedar Creek, right? Shipped down to North Carolina, escapes, makes it home, and survives the war. Richard Dowling, 23 years old of Southfield. What's interesting about this is these are a lot of names on a page, but these are lives. These are men that went through their own unique experience in the regiment. And I just decided to chart all of these because I found them to be really, really interesting. The youngest person to pass away in the regiment was 12 years old, Michael Gallagher. And get this, the regiment of the 156 is so unique because they actually recruited men while in the Confederacy. So while the 156 was in Louisiana in 1863, they actually posted recruiting stations in New Orleans and recruited Northern sympathizers in Louisiana. So they were Southerners that signed to serve in the 156. Again, one of the many unique features of the 156. And one of them is this young man, Michael Gallagher, 12 years old. He lived in New Orleans. He enlisted as a musician on August 20th, 1863, and he deserted from the regiment on May 14th, 1864. I'm sorry, I thought this was one of the ones that passed away. No, he was just the youngest to have enlisted in the 156 at 12 years old, but he actually deserted the regiment. The youngest soldier, quote-unquote soldier in the 156, was 16 years old. Stephen Herman was his name. He was from Esopus, New York, and he survived the war. So 16 years old was the youngest soldier with a rifle fighting, and he lived through the entire war. Let's see here. I don't have to read all of these. It's not necessary. Here's an interesting one. John P. Orstander, 45 years old, of Kingston, drowned. He drowned on October 24th, 1862 at Eddiesville, New York. A soldier actually drowned before even shipping off to the theater of war. Here's a really fun one here. Only 7 soldiers of the 156 were wounded in 2 battles, and all of them survived. How interesting is this? Charles Gay, 18 years old, of Northfield, was wounded at battles 3rd Winchester, Cedar Creek. He was actually taken prisoner of war at Cedar Creek, but he was paroled, meaning he was he received freedom, and he was discharged in 1865 in Virginia. Abner Bullion, who was 44 years old, of Kingston. He was wounded at battles Fort Bisland and 3rd Winchester. Henry C. Abbott, 30 years old, was of Castleton, was wounded at 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. Martin Bart, 39 years old, of Greenville, wounded at 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. John Thompson, not to be mixed up with Mr. Paul Thompson, 36 years old, of Castleton, again Long Island, was wounded at Port Hudson and 3rd Winchester. Jacob Wober was wounded at Kingston. I'm sorry, not wounded at Kingston. He was from Kingston and wounded at 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. And the most interesting of all, I saved him for last. His name is Ace Wheel. He was 26 years old. He was from New Orleans. So he was a Southern Union sympathizer. He enrolled with the regiment. He's fighting against his own native people in Louisiana. Very interesting story. 26 years old, wounded Port Hudson in the face of Confederate gunfire against his native statesmen. And he's also wounded at the Battle of 3rd Winchester. And the beautiful thing of all, he survives the war, he musters out with his regiment, and he returns home to Louisiana to be with his family. Couldn't imagine how torn his family must have been. The next part of this lecture presentation is death by disease. Now, I listed all of these names in chronological order. Talk about hours worth of research. So I wanted to know who's the first one to die? Who was the first one in country to die? How many men died in each year? I have quantitative reports. Doesn't make for a good lecture. If I had a PowerPoint presentation, I would have provided that for you, but regardless, we'll save that for a rainy day. So here's my disease report. 138 men died of disease, right? The report that I found online lumps disease and disability. I don't want that. I want to know how many men strictly died of disease. So this is the Kyle Williams report. 138 men perished to disease of the 156 New York during the Civil War. 138 men. That's a lot. 3 passed away in 1862. Think about that. 1862, they had just joined and they passed away from disease, right? 95 passed away in 1863. 19 passed away in 1864, and 21 passed away in 1865. I created the whole percentage of that. So of the 138 men, right, total, 69% died in 1863, followed by 15% in 1865. The first soldier to pass away in the 156, the very first soldier to have passed away, was Jacob Hong, 33 years old, of Kingston. He passed away in Kingston at Camp Sampson on October 12, 1862. Terrible. The first soldier to pass away in Louisiana in the theater of war was Ransom Anderson, 20 years old, man, of Warwarsing. He passed away in New Orleans on January 16, 1863. Again, you got to understand the history of the 156. We shipped off to the theater of war. Paul, when did we ship off to the theater of war? This is getting interactive now.
1862.
Late 1862, right? So early 1863, we're boots on the ground in Louisiana. So I would say within 20 days of being in Louisiana, we lost our first man to disease on January 16th. The last soldier to pass away was Jeremiah Cole, 23 years old, of Saugerties, and he passed away on November 2nd, 1865. So Appomattox Courthouse, when Lee surrendered, was in April of 1865, right? The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, April of 1865. These men are just seeing out the rest of their enlistment so they could go home. This poor man didn't have the opportunity to go home. He is the last man to have passed away in the regiment. Jeremiah Cole, 23 years old, Saugerties, November 2nd, 1865. The most consecutive days with death by disease was in 1863, when for 5 straight days, from Thursday, April 18th, until Monday, April 20th, 1863, we lost 8 men. We lost 8 men in 5 straight days. The most death by disease in one day was 3. On April 20th, 1863, we lost 3 men on one day. That was the highest amount. The month with the highest fatalities by disease was July of 1863, when we lost 15 soldiers. So the most men we lost in 1 month, 15 soldiers, July of 1863. Here we go. This is where I fumbled earlier. The youngest soldier to pass away from disease was Henry C. Durham, 14 years old, of Kingston. 14 years old. Died on July 8th, 1863 at Baton Rouge. The oldest soldier to pass away from disease was Charles Mansfield, 49 years old, of Warsing. The town, look at this. Come on, you gotta give me some credit here. The town that saw the most deaths by disease was Warsing, New York. 25 men in one town died of disease. Here's an interesting factoid I had to list. 4 Louisianians that joined the regiment died of disease. Jacob Steen, 27 years old, Ernest Michael, 36 years old, August Eckenbrock, 43 years old, and Alexander Jackson, 22 years old. 2 of them died in 1863, 2 of them died in 1865. All right? And one of the cool things about the muster roll, I'm sorry, this is a lengthy lecture, I apologize. I told you, it's gonna be about 30 minutes. I don't know what the timing is on this, so I'm sorry. The muster roll, right, the most quantitative evidence on the muster roll is just death by disease, right? So I wrote down the ones that didn't mention death by disease but were more specific. There weren't many. So here's what I found. 6 died of chronic diarrhea, 6 died of typhoid fever, and 1 died of epilepsy. Epilepsy. It's a seizure. So the rest are obviously notated death by disease, okay? The last phase, I know you guys are yawning at this point, I apologize, is my battle report, all right, okay? So I wanted to know the aggregate numbers of combat troops going into each battle. Now, I only did the Shenandoah Valley just for time's sake. The next lecture, if we do another one, will entail the fighting in Louisiana. So this is in the Shenandoah Valley, 1864. The first battle that we see is at the Battle of Third Winchester. 314 soldiers we took into the Battle of Third Winchester. 91 wounded, 20 killed, 2 were missing, aka POWs. We sustained 36% casualties at Third Winchester. I even wrote down the names of those that were captured at Third Winchester. 1 was taken POW and went to a POW camp in Salisbury, North Carolina. It's very unfortunate, but he died in a POW camp in North Carolina. The other gentleman survived and was paroled, okay? The Battle of Fisher's Hill, we took in about 200 men, thanks to Sir Paul Thompson. Him and I were trying to crunch the numbers, and we both settled on 200 men that went into Fisher's Hill. 4 were wounded, no killed, no POW, 2% casualties. Cedar Creek, the big one, right? The previous lecture that was bestowed upon you all with Nephi. 190 men went into combat, 29 wounded, 17 killed, 41 prisoners of war, 41, 5 missing, total 46, 48% casualties at Cedar Creek. That is a devastating loss. Now, this is what led me down a completely different rabbit hole, was the POWs. I never knew this. I knew there were POWs, but not that many POWs. So 41 POWs at Cedar Creek. 31 were paroled, thank the heavens. So 76% of the total, 41, were paroled, means they went to POW camps and they were released. Thank the heavens. 5 were sent to Northeast Bridge, North Carolina, 2 from Wilmington, North Carolina, and 24 from unknown locations. The muster rolls just didn't tell us where they went. 1 escaped, which I'd mentioned earlier, from Wilmington, North Carolina, and 6 died in POW camps. 4 in Salisbury, North Carolina, 2 in Richmond, Virginia. So 15% of the total that were POW died in POW camps, never had the opportunity to come back home. And obviously 3% never returned, so I'm assuming they also perished in POW camps. I have listed literally every single POW at Cedar Creek. I have their company, if they were paroled. Again, this would have made a better PowerPoint presentation. Again, these are names. These are men with lives like you and I, and POWs in the theater of war. Some made it home. Most made it home. Some did not. Here's the percentage breakdown. So 76% were paroled, which is great to see. 2% escaped, which was 1 person. 15% died in POW camps, 7% there. Interesting too, 3 men were taken prisoner in Virginia, I'm assuming by Colonel Mosby. These are the 3 men that were captured while in Virginia. All of them were paroled, thankfully. So I'm gonna cut this short. Hopefully you enjoyed the report. Stay tuned, more great lectures to come.